College football nerds here talking Alabama and Georgia, the biggest game of the year so far, a game that we've had circled since last year when these two teams played one another. Want to let everybody know the model is back. We have 4 weeks of data. There are some caveats because it's a little wonky given this early in the year, but feel free to check it out, collegefootballnerds.com. You can do our model with any two teams that you want to pit against one another, and it's using just this year's data, which is why it's a little silly just because, people have already had bye weeks. There's been teams that have only played G5 teams. So it needs a little more data to be truly solid, but there's some gems that it can pull out of there, just some trends that the model will see. There's also a 1 through 133 power ranking that you can check out on there that is purely generated by the model. Okay, so Josh, I want to start with the model just because there's some interesting things we also track in terms of relative performance that I think show how good these two teams are compared to the rest of the country. But last year, our model made its debut in a video we did with with Georgia and Auburn. And we had a little bit of an issue early on, but ultimately it had Georgia winning, but really close, like a 2-point favorite, 3-point spread, something like that. And we were just clowned on the internet. Like, people were like, this model is trash, this is crazy. But then ultimately that game was really close. Beck had a great kind of game-winning drive, good fourth quarter. Georgia came out, on top, but it was a tight game. Model covered in that game. This one has the model favoring Alabama by a couple of points. But what's more interesting to me is just how low scoring it's predicting. And I think some of that is with the data that we have at our disposal this year. But just looking at kind of the yards per play numbers that it's expecting, I think it's a testament to really less saying bad about the offenses, but more saying what the model is seeing in terms of data this year relative to everybody else, that these are two just exceptional defenses.
Yeah, so when you dig into the model, and you can go to collegefootballnerds.com. You can go to the top, get model any teams. We let you do some for free. You do as many as you want for free. You run the model enough, it's going to ask you for a login. The login is completely free. Lets you vote in our top 25 poll. No obligation. Just a little push to get you to create a login and join our community. But everything's totally free. We don't sell the information, to be clear, or anything like that. But it gives us a data point, right? We always say our model is really the best trend predictor that I'm aware of on the internet for college football. It's based purely on on-field performance just from this year. We don't factor in recruiting. We don't factor in last year's results. That's why other models or FPI is going to look more normal in week 3 or 4. That's why we don't run our model in week 1 or 2. But FPI is going to tell you what you think you already know. Because at the end of the day, when you're using priors, it's telling you that the team is like last year's team. And what we saw in the NFL and the transfer portal is in prior years, FPI's mean error was a little better than ours. Last year, we did significantly better than FPI and some SP Plus and some others because, like, for example, Colorado, our model had no preconceived notions of what Colorado was going to be. So it had them in the 50s pretty much from the get-go, whereas the others, most of the major models had them starting around 100th. Week 4 or 5, they were 70th, 50th by the end of the year. So we were kind of ahead of the curve. When you look purely at on-field performance and you do a prediction, the defenses are well ahead of the offense. So relative performance means how did you do against the teams you played versus how those teams did against everyone else. We don't quite have enough connective tissue. We don't use FCS data either. So between bye weeks and FCS games, there's a lot of teams that only played 2 games, and that doesn't really help us. But what it has defensively, it has Alabama holding teams to 55% under their passing averages. So, you only get about 45% of your yards per attempt through the year. That's a crazy high number. Sustainably, elite is about 70, about a 30% reduction. 55% reduction is unsustainably high, but that's how good they've been. And then 21% under their rushing averages. So you want to look at it, they're holding teams to 45% passing and 79% rushing. That is a very good borderline elite rush defense. A little couple chinks there. Totally insanely elite pass defense. Georgia's a similar deal. 47% under passing averages, 54% under rushing averages. That is just a tick behind Alabama in passing. Still crazy numbers. The difference is that Georgia's been dominant in terms of run defense in a way Alabama hasn't quite been. basically cutting your run game in half, where Alabama cuts it by a quarter. And that really affects a lot of the model results otherwise, because offensively, just to round it out, Alabama, their rushing yards per game is over 100% higher from relative performance, right? They're one of the top rushing offenses in the country. By our model, 14th per play, 9th per game. They're only 40th, though, in passing. They're not a phenomenal passing offense. They don't throw the ball a lot. They haven't been very efficient when they do. Georgia is a more balanced team, but not necessarily a great one. 50th in yard per attempt relative performance, 24th in rushing. And so you have an Alabama team that has run the ball exceedingly well, thrown it just okay, and a Georgia team that's been okay through the air and good on the run. So I think overall what the model is telling you is that these two defenses are elite. Georgia's run defense is a little bit better. Alabama's run offense is a little bit better. That ends up matching up pretty well squarely 1-to-1. And the model result, Daniel, is Alabama 8, Georgia 6. I don't think that's realistic how low it is. A lot of that is the wonkiness of the model, how early the season it is, and some weird data like how much Alabama got shut down, the Georgia Kentucky game. But I do think that the model is kind of right that it's a strength-on-strength matchup in terms of the defenses are elite where the other offense wants to be good. And there's not really an edge for either team offensively to expect either one to put up a ton of points in this game.
Yeah, and I think that, one of the things that I want to talk about, and it kind of fits in with these numbers, both of these fan bases have been frustrated by giving up long, grueling drives. Georgia more so against Kentucky, and Alabama, I think they've had one long drive that they've given up like 17 to 20 play drive in each of their 3 games so far. But if you dig into it, what's interesting is it's frustrating as a fan because you can't get a team off the field. But as it relates to how good your defense is playing, one, both of these teams are holding teams to field goals a lot, if they score at all. And 2, it's really hard to keep a college football team off the field if they're willing to shorten the game so much and potentially lose really big by getting 3 yards of play, by never doing anything explosive, by never doing anything vertically, which Kentucky did to Georgia. They're like, look, we're going to shorten the game. You're going to get 30% fewer possessions than you normally would, which we're hoping will keep your scoring down. But it also implicitly limits their ability to score, because what it means is if you take away all your verticality in your offense, you're having to score from the 10-yard line out every time, which means you're going to be kicking a lot of field goals against the Georgia and Alabama defense. So, talk about that a little bit in terms of like how it might be frustrating to watch as a fan of one of these teams, but at a high level, it speaks to how good these defenses are. Just you should like it even though you hate it.
Yeah, there's a shift here between these two teams and where they were a year ago. So Brian Fremeau is a big friend of our channel. You can go to bcftoys.com and look at FEI, and one of the big things he has is points per drive. That's not something we currently have in our data. Long story short, our data is not really well suited to get all this put together and to do points per drive in the way we'd like. It's something we want to add on a more consistent basis. But right now we do scoring more per game than per drive due to it's a data consistency issue. We actually try to avoid putting out statistics where we don't quite trust the data sources we're using or the accuracy we do it. Last year, Georgia was 3rd in the country in offensive points per drive, 3.93 points per drive. They averaged over a field goal per offensive possession in 2023. Alabama was 27th, 2.68, basically a point a drive less, over almost a point and a half a drive less than Georgia, but that's still good for 27th in the country. This year, that's actually flipped more than a little bit. Alabama is now 14th in the country, averaging 3.4 points per drive. They average over a field goal per possession. Georgia's kind of fallen off the map, frankly. They're 68th in the country, 2.2 points per drive. That doesn't sound like a lot, but in a 12 possession game, that's about 14 points, 15 points different, right? And to your point about the shortening of games on top of that, we always talked about a lot with Georgia in the past few years. Their scores weren't overly high because they ran the ball a lot. They were willing to snap the ball late in the play clock. They didn't play a lot of possessions. And college football is really wonky in that some teams play 17 possessions and some teams play 11. The 17 possession games are always going to be higher scoring than the 11 possession games. Did not mean the 17 possession offense is actually better, because what matters is how much you scored within the time frame you have given to you. And if you play at a higher tempo, the other team gets the ball more. This is a big problem with Tennessee analytically versus Georgia, because Tennessee plays at hyperspeed and they will play 50% more possessions in a game, so they necessarily score more points, even though, like last year, Georgia, a couple of years ago, Georgia scored considerably more per possession than Tennessee did. And in this game, where I think both teams are going to run the ball a lot, the game's going to end up short. The clock rules are going to shorten the game. And you got a Georgia team that doesn't score as much per possession. It's going to make the score low. And the reason Georgia felt comfortable or felt dominant is they were scoring at the most effective, efficient, consistent clip in the country over the last 3 years. What we've seen from Georgia so far this year is not that pace. And so it probably will be frustrating that you have what is a shortened game, but now with a team that does not score as often, and then the score is going to be that much lower. It's going to be that much more inconsistent. And we still don't know how much of an aberration that Kentucky game was. But at the end of the day, this is going to maybe look more like Georgia versus Missouri, from the recent past, right? An inconsistent, shaky offense. And Daniel, I want to add to that, because when we talk about where Georgia is, there are two things that are affecting them, I think. One, the offensive line injury, losing, you lose an All-American guard. It's going to affect you the same way Alabama effectively lost an All-American guard versus South Florida. He was playing tackle, but he's not a phenomenal tackle, so they were effectively out an All-American guard. Both teams clearly affected by that. But the other problem with Georgia is, initially we were always questioning how in the world can you run an explosive offense through a tight end and Brock Bowers. Brock Bowers is just proving in the NFL is a truly generational prospect. And Ladd McConkey was a grossly underrated player. And they are missing those guys. That was the most efficiency-driven offense I've ever seen the last few years. And it is, I think, readily apparent that having an elite slot player and a generational tight end was a big key to being extremely efficient. And they don't have that level of efficiency. Plus, they don't really have the deep threats in the back end. I think Lovett's the best receiver. Arian Smith has a lot of potential. He hasn't put it all together yet. And so a lot of those question marks we'd had offensively that Georgia had just proven out they could overcome it with pure efficiency in an almost unprecedented level. They don't have that efficiency, but they didn't really add anything from an explosiveness perspective. And the offense, I think, ends up just more shaky as a result.
So this summer, sort of the guesstimate on open would be Georgia favored by 4.5. It actually opened 2.5. It's down to 2 now with a 48.5 over under. I think a lot of this plays into sort of how we've discussed how the game might go and how the model sees how the game might go. Obviously, more points will be scored than the model saying 8-6 right now, but I think the margin is about right. Who that margin is for when it's this close is pretty random. You've still got Georgia number 1. I've got a number 2. You've got a number 1 in your top 10 that we did that's going to be coming out later this week. And your point there has been, look, the Kentucky game was ugly. Georgia has one of these every year, like Missouri, like Auburn, and is still the best team in the country. They also have the Clemson data point, and now that we see what Clemson is doing as an offense especially, even though it's against lesser competition, it sort of proves that 34-3 out as being a really dominant win over a good team. Clemson may not be a top 10, top 5 team, but still not a lot of people, if anybody, is going to beat them that way. On the flip side, though, Josh, and what I want to talk about to you is I think there is a potential positive for Alabama and a potential negative for Alabama that have come out of the same games that they've played. So, as you've noted, they had to play a lot of shuffling with the offensive line against South Florida, put on a couple of touchdowns late, 42-16 or whatever, looked pretty good. With Wisconsin, Van Dyke goes down in the first drive. Alabama blows them out they did look better, much better as an offensive line. So I will start with that. They also look better from a penalty standpoint. There's two things here. On one side, I think that it's very plausible that Alabama hasn't shown who they are in their whole bag in terms of offensive capabilities and defensive capabilities, because when Van Dyke goes down in that Wisconsin was the game that they were going to have to go into their bag potentially on the road against a Big Ten team, against a roster. When Van Dyke goes down, that changes the calculus a little bit, and you can sort of keep some of that reserved for Georgia in a way that Georgia may not be able to do because Kentucky is maybe a better team, and so they maybe had to show a little more. I think there's that possibility that's on the table. But also, the same thing, the inverse is true in that because we're giving Alabama a pass on offensive line against South Florida, and because Van Dyke went down in the Wisconsin game, there's the potential that these scores that Alabama has put up, or the excuses we're giving Alabama, aren't really, they're kind of fool's gold, in that Alabama maybe doesn't beat Wisconsin big, or maybe doesn't beat them if Van Dyke doesn't go down. So there's some question marks on both sides, meaning some of those question marks might mean Alabama is better than we think they are, and some of them might mean that they're actually worse than the scores are showing.
It's interesting to me because Alabama's played really well on one side of the ball or the other in these games in a manner that was hard to judge because the other side of the ball was so lopsided. And what I mean by that is the South Florida game, Alabama's defense, by and large, just shut down South Florida. And then they had a couple of drives they put together, but they had multiple interceptions. South Florida's just flailing, punting the ball constantly. And, the whole nature with Barry on Brown, sort of like the Miami games, when he completes a couple passes, he's a top 5 athlete at quarterback. So they can move the ball some, but they couldn't do that more than a couple drives. But Alabama I think there were 17 possessions in that game, Daniel. That's a lot of possessions to score on. And as I think people know, they didn't put up, they have 14 points, 12 points in the start of the fourth quarter. That was not a game that Alabama was in any way in control of. They switched right tackles late in the game, scored 3 times in a row, and suddenly it was a blowout. And it was just deceptive. I think the Wisconsin game's kind of similar, right? Van Dyke goes down in the first quarter. Wisconsin's offense goes in completely turtle mode. Alabama's defense is able to dominate. The offense sort of takes control, but slowly. And so both of those games, the defensive dominance due to the issues on the other side were telling. In the South Florida game, the defense for Alabama really had to step up and had to play at an elite level the whole game because they had to, because the offense couldn't do anything with the offensive line issue. But I think you saw a game against Wisconsin, which I think is a very good Wisconsin defense. Now, I think they might be susceptible to the run more than people realize due to injury issues and whatnot. But you saw them play a really complete game offensively, and I think against South Florida, you saw them play a complete game defensively. The question becomes, okay, well, if they have everything together and everybody's healthy, they'll just put them together and be complete offense and defense. That's a tough assumption to make, and it's a dangerous one, I think, to make, to your point, Daniel. But it also is equally true to say, well, they're capable of playing at that level on both sides of the ball. So I think both of these teams, you start running into the same problem. How do you evaluate them with such limited data? I don't think you do. And this is why we always say data should be a starting point. Why our model is a trend predictor and a pure performance model. It's not our absolute go-to in terms of picking games and scores. It'll get much better at the end of the year. It'll be probably quite accurate. But we use it as a tool to try to make our determinations. And I'll tell you, Daniel, I think here, for example, in the model, there is something that's kind of useful or telling. And that's the fact that, when you look at the comparisons between the two teams, Alabama in rushing offense, Georgia rushing defense is about even. Alabama's rushing defense has an edge over Georgia's offense by a little bit. However, neither one of these teams is expected to throw the football. And I think that matches what a lot of my analysis would be. When I've seen these teams, I've seen some teams run on Alabama. They've gone to a one-gap scheme, which means they're more disruptive. They've been better against the pass. They get more tackles for loss. But they've given up a lot more 6, 7, 8, 9-yard carries, which Alabama fans some of them are freaking out about, I think. Georgia's still a 2-gap scheme, but I don't think that defensive line is what it has been a few years ago. I think the starters are good, and then the depth isn't quite the same. I know, again, guys have been banged up. But when you pan it all out, I think both these teams may run the ball a little better than they have in recent years in these matchups. I think both these teams may struggle to throw the football. And this is the interesting part to me, Daniel, is I say they may struggle to throw the football, even though to me, the question mark for both these defenses is really the secondary. Alabama's secondary is rebuilt. I've seen guys run wide open on them in multiple games. Georgia's defense has a lot of turnovers in the back end. They've given up some pass plays at times. The trick, though, is I think they're good enough at Georgia on the back end, and Alabama is wonky enough in the passing game. I don't know that they can capitalize. And Alabama may let guys go, but their pass rush and the disruptiveness of their defense has kind of overwhelmed teams. And I haven't seen from Georgia that they're really capable of dealing with that. Beck's gotten rattled on the road or in neutral sites on multiple occasions. Happened in the last Alabama game, happened in the Kentucky game. He doesn't seem to do well when teams can actually get pressure on him. So to me, Daniel, this really turns into a low-scoring game where both teams can run the ball better than maybe expected, but both teams may really flail throwing it. And I think the numbers back that up, but I'm curious if you agree with that.
I think that it really boils down to the question of whether or not explosiveness happens for Alabama, because they're not going to consistently drop the ball. Although, we've talked a little bit in the past about how the intermediate game isn't there, but they look like they've replaced it with, we're going to get our first downs running the ball with the quarterback, zone read game, things like that. And I do think that they've held back some of their bag, be it like orbit motion, reverse stuff. I think we saw one reverse from them that was pretty interesting in week 1. Georgia, you're going to get what you're going to get. They probably have held some back defensively too, because they haven't had an offense, faced an offense that they're really worried about. But for me, the winner of this game is the one that can find some plays in the explosive side of things. I don't think either one of the teams is going to drop the ball with any kind of consistency. You do make a good point, though, about Beck. I think he does get rattled a little bit too. ESPN's model's got Alabama winning this with a 60% chance of winning, which I don't know where they get that from. I've seen a couple other models that's got Alabama winning. Our model's got Alabama winning, but I'm guessing you've got a different score, at least not 8-6, 10-5, like we've seen some of these models spit out.
No, I don't think it's going to be 8-6. And there's, long story short, there's some real quirks with the data for this game in particular, just because they both come off a bye week and there's not enough. I'll go ahead and give my score prediction, Daniel. I have this game 24-21 Alabama right now. I think the spread being a couple points is right. The factor that I'm thinking of, to your point, is I think Alabama has the potential for explosiveness a little more than Georgia. In these low-scoring games, we talk about this a lot. If you can connect on one or two deep plays, if you can get, like Michigan versus USC, if Michigan does not have one of those long touchdown runs, they were not going to drive the field and win that game enough consistently. And those plays are extremely hard to predict. There's a variability factor. You can say you run it enough, you get one or two of them. It's not really true. Sometimes you have a game like that where you connect on 4. Sometimes you get a game where you connect on 0, especially when you're throwing deep, which is where Alabama is. I do think offensively, Alabama has improved a lot with how they use Milroe. We've talked a little bit about between each other. They're a lot more intentional, I think, on how they use the quarterback. The quarterback run game before, it felt like a tack-on to a pro-style offense, that they just had some plays they ran. It kind of obvious when they're doing it. They would run different formations with multiple backs in the backfield or motion wide receiver in the backfield, and you knew they were doing the quarterback run game. Now, it is much more a design component of the offense. A lot of that is they actually run jet sweeps as a normal component of the offense, which gets a wide receiver in the backfield, which lets you naturally run quarterback counters and things, because you create this counter motion for the linebackers that you can then run power behind. They had a beautiful play in the Wisconsin game where they did that, and then they basically ran a counter. It's a lead counter with a halfback being the lead. The halfback, Jam Miller, gets a great block on the linebacker, and then Milroe basically runs in untouched. And part of that's play design. Part of it is Milroe's athleticism, that he can get that corner and run in without getting touched, which a lot of guys couldn't do. But as drawn up, it's very difficult to deal with. And I agree with you. I think that's kind of replaced the lack of intermediate passing game. I don't know how sustainable it is, but this is the big thing to me when I talk about explosiveness. One, I think Arian Smith can be that guy for Georgia, but I haven't seen it yet. I'll be honest, I actually think Beck is a better quarterback than Milroe still. I think he is. I'm very high on Carson Beck. He's just not the most mobile guy, and I don't think they have the right weapons around him right now, or at least they haven't progressed well enough. But ultimately, a lot of this to me comes down to scheme. Georgia's scheme is a two-gap scheme. They have guys like Chambliss on the edge. They don't have great edge players right now, and they struggle with teams like Auburn in recent years that run the zone read, that have sort of a mesh point and then attack the edges. That two-gap scheme, Smart, just like Saban before him, doesn't really pride itself on pressure. It prides itself on containing the quarterback. You really contain the run game and explosives in the run game, at least between the tackles. But when you play those zone read game, when you play running quarterbacks, the problem is it usually gives a numbers advantage to the offense, and it makes it a lot easier to get the edge. And if you don't have great edge players, suddenly the defense has to chase side to side. It helps Georgia that they're more zone-based, but they still have that general philosophy, and it's not something you can turn off. So I think Georgia fans may point to, let's say, 2021, when they played Bryce Young, twice. The first time they really used a bad scheme. They didn't attack the pocket. The second time they were a lot more aggressive. They were more successful. I don't think they have that switch they can flip. I don't think they have the personnel to do it. And a lot of what they're going to deal with Alabama, if they want to be aggressive, is they're going to really struggle on the edges because just the nature of the 3-4 defense they're running. And then Alabama, with a lot of they have a lot of those Heupel principles in terms of having guys really wide to either side of the field, stacking receivers, creates problems for matchups and gets safeties out of the box. And if you don't have them in the box, they take deep shots. That's why they take so many kind of empty deep shots on third and medium. Is they're playing this numbers game where if the safety comes down, you go over the top because there's no safety help, and if the safety stays up, you attack the edge with a run game, particularly with a quarterback run. I think that's a schematic problem for Georgia. They're not well built for these schemes. The same way we talked about in the preview for Alabama. Alabama has not been well built to deal with Auburn or Tennessee because of the scheme they've been running, particularly because it was man-based with a lot of the same front seven concepts. Georgia's still there. Alabama's moved to an offensive scheme that's more difficult. But, Daniel, for me to say that I had Alabama 24-21, I also acknowledge the other side at this point. I talked about how Alabama going to a one-gap scheme is probably going to make them worse defensively against Georgia. They're going to be more susceptible to the run game. They're going to be more susceptible to 8-9 yard carries. So a lot of this too hinges on the fact of whether Georgia can actually capitalize on that. If they had the run game they've had from some recent years, I'd be more confident. Daniel, my problem is I haven't seen that from Georgia this year. Their rush offense, as we're saying offensively, it's just good, not great. 24th right now in relative performance rushing. They've been a much better unit than that. And if the run game shows up, I think they have the chance to really pummel Alabama and probably really frustrate some Alabama fans who are used to dominating on the ground in Saban's scheme. And they haven't really experienced the reality of a Georgia team that's going to get 6 yards a carry, and you just feel this slow impending death. Mid-2000s, late 2010 Alabama, mode death of we're never going to stop this run game and they're going to score. So to me, that's the biggest avenue for Georgia winning is whether or not the run game can be good enough. Because if you're good enough on the run, nothing else really matters. Alabama can't really rush the passer. You're good and down in distance. Carson Beck is going to be able to be comfortable.
I think the spread is tightened up because Alabama is viewed to be a much more quality team than people. I think some people wanted to wait and see if they fell off when Saban left, and also just the questions of who they've got coming back. And you've got a whole new coaching staff, and you might have a good coaching staff long term, but how does it work in the first year? Alabama to me looks very competent. I think that Georgia's right now a better team. I think by the end of the year, Alabama might grow into being a better team than Georgia because I think you've got what you're going to get from Georgia in terms of improvements. I think they're already there. I think they're already one of the best teams in the country. I have concerns about Alabama's boom or bust offense and about their interior run defense. Wisconsin was able to run pretty well against Alabama. Nobody's thrown on them, which, like you said, is a little vexing given the concerns in secondary. But I do think, and you and I have talked about this, everybody Klatt harped on this about the passes, the open receivers that have been missed by opposing quarterbacks. He even pointed out one in the Wisconsin game where the quarterback got earholed immediately after he let go of the ball. I think for all of the wide receivers running free commentary, there's not enough people talking about the fact that quarterbacks are throwing to those open receivers under severe duress in a way we haven't seen from Alabama in recent past. They are more disruptive up front. They are more of a threat to get to the quarterback, but I think that they are giving up some in that interior run game, and it's enough that Georgia can be consistent, in my opinion. And I just don't know. Like, to me, if Alabama still does have a considerable portion of their offense that they haven't shown and a portion of their defense that they haven't shown, I think Alabama might be the best team in the country. I feel like, though, it's more that the herky-jerky nature of the offense and the boom or bust, which does include boom, we can't just focus on bust, it relies a lot. It is who they are at this point. We've seen a lot from Jalen Milroe this year that we've seen in years past, where the most maddening thing, if you're an Alabama fan, is to have 2nd and 4 and watch Jalen Milroe throw to the boundary 40 yards down the field into double coverage into a pass that gets completed 1 out of 50 times. There's nothing more, especially when your defense just gave up a 17-yard drive for a field goal. Like, you see these 3 and outs, and a lot of them are self-inflicted when you're like, just get 4 yards. And there's still that there where maybe it's awareness or maybe it's just that the offense is always going to go vertical, in that you want to see a team move the ball down the field and they're not getting the 4 yards. They're throwing bombs, and sometimes they connect and sometimes they don't. I just don't see enough of that consistently there to score against this Georgia defense. But I do think, I'm going to say this until people believe me or until people wake up, Jam Miller is the best running back in the country. He's technically not a starter. He's behind Justice Haynes. But, last week Miller had what he had and Haynes had 2 carries. Jam Miller is the best running back in the country. The end. If he doesn't get hurt, people will realize that by the end of the year. I don't think Bama finds enough points to win this game right now. Give me Georgia 27, Alabama 20, and let's revisit this in November as Alabama gets more comfortable in their offense and their defense. And at the end of the day, because of the 12-team playoff, it doesn't matter. Alabama can lose this game, they can lose to Tennessee, and they can still make the playoffs. But yeah, that's what I've got. Josh, tell me if just in your gut, because I've kind of touched on this a couple of times. How much do you think these teams have not shown that they're going to show Saturday, if any?
Well, it's funny. So I can draw one point that you've twice now you've dropped the bomb of saying Jam Miller you think is the best running back in the country at the end of the video. I didn't respond the last time. I don't agree with you completely. I'll be honest, but I think he's very very good. But one of the reasons I don't agree with you is I think a lot of what Jam Miller has been able to do for Alabama has been sort of reflective of the type of defenses they played. Teams have played Alabama boom or bust defensively. They've been in a mode where they attack very aggressively with the blitz game. They're attacking the line of the scrimmage, right, with blitzes, giving them a lot of single coverage. They've been saying, hey, Milroe, we're going to dare you to throw down the field consistently because we think if we attack you, we can get you out of the pocket. We can bring you down and get a lot of sacks. Alabama was terrible in sacks last year. And we think we don't think you can process fast enough to be able to be effective. Jam Miller is a one cut and run kind of guy, and when you have guys like that rushing the football, it does create a situation where he's extremely effective because he cuts and goes the same way Corum was for Michigan, who got attacked for various reasons in a similar way. I think Georgia has a pretty darn good player in Trevor Etienne that just didn't play at the start of the season, and I think kind of flown under the radar how good he is and can be. I talked a lot about, we switched from college style to NFL style passing and rush statistics. It was some tweets we put out in the offseason. And I noted Florida was like a top 5 rush offense when you took sacks out of the equation, which I think reflects how good Etienne is. But I'll also say I don't think Georgia is going to play the same style of defense. Complete boomer bust, uber aggression the way South Florida runs it is not the style that they want to run. They're more zone-based. They do have zone pressures. But Kirby Smart is always going to focus on having a schematically sound defense. He's not going to give up easy points. And again, when you run that boomer bust style defense, you are allowing the other team to score 20, 30 points if they hit on some plays. And if you're Georgia, you don't want to take this risk that if they happen to connect, they're going to put up 30 plus points and you're probably just going to lose. You want to play them more straight up. I actually think this is a game where like Justice Haynes, the other back, might actually be the better back, because I don't think it's going to be as much take a seam. I think it's going to be more navigating traffic. Again, Georgia's two-gap scheme is more about catching the run, not about penetrating. And when you're catching, you want a guy to sort of laterally navigate, which he's better at. Where I think Etienne maybe is the more balanced overall, could be arguably I think the better player because he's got a little more of both. There's just so many factors here, and ultimately, Daniel, this is my takeaway. This is a game I think you absolutely could play 10 times, and at best coming out of it, I think we're going to think one team would win 6 out of 10, even if they win by 25 points, much like 2021 where Alabama won big and then lost big the second time. This to me is like picking a NFL matchup where teams are very close in quality. The difference is there's some things you can tweak out, but depending on how things go and how they play, it's going to really determine the outcome of the game, and they can play multiple times and you can get very different results. It's exciting, it's fun to see, and to your point, if Georgia loses this game, they're still going to be in like almost a shoe-in for the 12-team playoff as long as they don't lose more than 3 games, in my opinion, and they're going to be back in there at the end of the day. So these are 2 teams that are going to improve over the course of the season, could play this game a million times and come out differently. And yeah, it's going to be fun to see how it turns out, and really, I think, learn a lot about where these 2 teams are at right now.
All right, give us your score predictions in the comments. Let Josh know how he's wrong and that Jalen Milroe is the best running back in the country. And by the way, my takeaway from that is, like, the reason I think that is because of, honestly, how patient I felt he's been. Not so much the long runs, but we'll see. There's a long season to prove out Josh being right or wrong. We'll see. Also, don't forget, collegefootballnerds.com. You can play around with this model. Again, there will be some wonkiness in the data. It gets better as the season goes on, especially when we have more than a couple of games to feed it from both of these 2 teams. And let us know what you think about this game and who your player of the game is going to be. I think that's always a good one to talk about. Thanks so much, y'all. Have a great week, and God bless.